In the vast tapestry of Irish mythology, there are many gods and goddesses who shine brightly, commanding reverence through their roles as creators, warriors, or rulers of the natural world. But among them, there is one figure who is cloaked in more mystery, more darkness, and more awe than almost any other: the Morrigan. She is not a goddess of simple definitions. She is not just war, not just death, not just fate. She is all of these things, and more, braided together into a presence so vast that storytellers for centuries have struggled to capture her true essence. One of the most haunting features of the Morrigan is that she is not always one. She is often spoken of as a triple goddess, three sisters who are one, and one who is three. Like a crow circling above a battlefield, her image seems to shift depending on where you stand and which face of her power you are looking at. The trio most often linked with the Morrigan are Bab, Machu, and Nemain. Each name carries its own shadow, its own weapon, and its own whisper of terror. Bab, whose name means crow, is the embodiment of battle fury itself. In the old tales, she doesn't simply fight, she shrieks. Her voice is the sound of death rushing down upon warriors. Her cry so piercing it could unman the bravest fighter before a sword was even raised. She is the crow that feeds on corpses, the storm of chaos that sweeps through the battlefield and leaves only silence behind. Machu, by contrast, represents sovereignty and the land itself. She is the goddess tied to kingship and the prosperity of Ireland. But her blessing, like her wrath, was not lightly given. Kings who failed in their duty to the land would face her curses, and Ireland itself could wither under her anger. Machu stands as a reminder that power over people means nothing without responsibility to the earth that sustains them. Then there is Nemain, whose domain is frenzy and terror. If Bab is the crow that signals death, Nemain is the madness that grips men before they die. She spreads confusion in the minds of soldiers, turning friends against one another, sowing panic so deeply that armies might slaughter themselves before a single spear is thrown. In some stories, Nemain simply appears on a battlefield, and that alone is enough to cause entire hosts of warriors to fall upon each other in fear. Together, these three goddesses create a picture of the Morrigan that is as unsettling as it is fascinating. She is not a simple goddess of war in the way that Ares was to the Greeks, or Mars to the Romans. The Morrigan is something more primal, more psychological. She is war itself, in all its dimensions: the bloodshed, the terror, the chaos, but also the order that emerges when sovereignty is respected and the balance of the land is upheld. But the triple nature of the Morrigan also tells us something deeper about how the ancient Irish viewed divinity. The Celts often conceived of their gods in multiples, pairs, triads, even whole families that were more like living archetypes than singular individuals. The Morrigan, as a goddess who could be one or three, or even more, depending on the tale, embodies this fluid way of seeing the divine. It reflects the reality of war and fate itself, never one-sided, never simple, always layered. Some traditions expand the Morrigan's forms even further. In certain myths, other names are linked with her: Onund, Fia, or even Buin, suggesting that her essence was so vast it spilled beyond just three faces. She was a shapeshifter not only in form, but in identity. To try to pin her down was like trying to trap a raven's shadow. And yet, despite this multiplicity, the Morrigan was always recognized as a singular force. Warriors did not mistake her for three separate beings. They knew that the terror of Bab, the sovereignty of Machu, and the frenzy of Nemain were all facets of one vast and terrible goddess. When she appeared, whether as a beautiful maiden or a crow with black feathers glinting in the sun, her presence was unmistakable. The triple goddess structure also reveals another truth about her. The Morrigan does not simply belong to the battlefield. She belongs to the cycle of life itself. Just as the Celts saw life as a wheel, birth, death, and rebirth, the Morrigan represents the cycle of conflict, the chaos before the battle, the bloodshed during, and the silence after. She is present at every stage, shaping fate with her whispers, her cries, and her watchful gaze from above. In many ways, the Morrigan reflects the way the Irish understood the inevitability of death. To them, war was not just the clash of swords. It was a spiritual reality, where the land, the gods, and human destiny all collided. The Morrigan stood at the crossroads of all three. She could be an ally, granting kings her blessing and ensuring the prosperity of their reign. Or she could be a destroyer, tearing apart armies, cursing rulers, and watching the earth drink deeply of blood. So when we speak of the Morrigan as a triple goddess, it is not just mythology. It is a symbol of her power, to be many, to be shifting, to be more than human minds can easily comprehend. She is one, she is three, she is countless. She is the crow perched on a battlefield wall, watching silently as the cycle of life and death plays out before her. And she is the whisper in the ear of every king, reminding him that power is never free, that it is always tied to the land and to fate. The Morrigan as the triple goddess is a mirror of war itself, fractured, many-sided, and always dangerous. To look at her is to look into the heart of conflict, and to see that no matter how you divide her, the result is always the same. She is the goddess of fate, and fate is inescapable. If there is one place where the Morrigan is most at home, it is the battlefield. Not the quiet court of kings, not the hearth of families, but the clash of spears, the screams of warriors, and the stench of blood on the soil. She is not merely a goddess who observes war. She is war. She is its fury, its chaos, its inevitability. In the myths, when armies gathered and the tension of violence hung heavy in the air, people would look to the skies. If a crow circled above, it was not just a bird. It was an omen. It was the Morrigan, watching, deciding, shaping what was about to unfold. To see her was to know that the hand of fate was already writing in blood. The Morrigan was not like the Greek Ares, who delighted in the physical act of battle. Nor was she like Athena, who embodied the strategy of war. She was far more terrifying than either, because she represented the very forces that made men break, falter, and die. She was the roar in the ears of soldiers, the sudden panic that made their shields feel too heavy, the shadow on the ground that told them death was standing behind them. One of her most terrifying powers was her ability to instill fear. The Morrigan did not always need to fight. She could unravel an army before the first blow was struck. In some stories, her very cry from above was enough to throw soldiers into chaos. Imagine standing in a line of spears, your heart pounding, sweat dripping down your back, the enemy waiting across the field, and then hearing the shriek of a crow that you know is not of this world. Suddenly, your courage drains away. You glance at your brothers beside you, and their eyes are wide with the same terror. Some drop their weapons. Some run. Some, in blind panic, lash out at friend and foe alike. That was the Morrigan's warcraft, not just blood, but fear. She also carried with her the image of death's aftermath. The battlefield, when all was done, belonged to her. She is often described perched on corpses, a crow feasting upon the dead. But to the Irish, this was not just gruesome, it was sacred. The Morrigan did not only destroy life. She also ensured that the dead were claimed, that their passing was not wasted. She was both destroyer and guardian, both chaos and balance. Perhaps her most famous involvement in war is found in the Táin Bua Chálnge, the great Irish epic of cattle raids and heroism. In this tale, she appears before the hero Cú Chulainn, offering him her love and her aid in the coming battles. But when he refuses her, she does not simply vanish in shame, she vows vengeance. Later, as he fights, she returns again and again in different forms, an eel that trips him, a wolf that attacks his cattle, a cow that charges him. Each time, he wounds her, but he cannot kill her. For who can slay war itself? Later still, she returns in disguise as an old woman, offering him milk. When he blesses her, not knowing who she is healed. The story shows the duality of the Morrigan. She is both enemy and healer, destroyer and savior, depending on the choices of those who face her. For Cú Chulainn, she was fate incarnate, inescapable, ever returning, always present on the field where he made his name and where he would meet his doom. The Morrigan's war is not glorious. She strips away the illusions that many cultures drape around combat. To the Greeks, battle could be noble, even beautiful. To the Norse, it was the proving ground of honor and the gateway to Valhalla. But to the Irish vision embodied in the Morrigan, war was raw, terrifying, and bloody. It was not about honor, but about survival. It was not about fame, but about the will of fate. Her presence reminds us that war is not a stage for heroes, it is a graveyard for them. And yet, she was not only the herald of death. For those who fought with her blessing, she could be a force of protection. Some kings claimed that she sided with them in battle, granting them victory through her power. In these moments, the Morrigan was not simply death, but also destiny. Her favor could turn the tide of wars, ensuring that a ruler's reign was secure and his enemies broken. But this favor was never permanent, never guaranteed. To rely on the Morrigan was to embrace the same chaos she embodied. Sometimes she would lift you up, and sometimes she would cast you down, all according to the deeper currents of fate. The battlefield, then, was her temple. The clash of swords was her hymn. The cries of the dying were her prayers. To the people of ancient Ireland, the Morrigan was not a figure to be worshipped lightly. She was a goddess whose presence could not be controlled, only acknowledged. To honor her was to acknowledge the truth that war is never clean, never just, never merciful. It is blood and fear, triumph and ruin, all woven together in one storm. And that storm is the Morrigan. When we think of her as the goddess of war, we must remember that she does not glorify it. She embodies its rawest truths. She is the shriek before the charge, the confusion in the ranks, the crow on the corpse. And when the dust settles, when the field is quiet again, she is still there, watching, waiting, ready to rise again wherever swords are drawn and men spill blood upon the earth. When we think of the Morrigan, the image that most often comes to mind is that of the black crow circling above the battlefield, shrieking omens of death and feasting on the fallen. But if we look deeper into Irish myth, we find another, equally important face of this goddess, one tied not to the sword, but to the soil. Because the Morrigan was not only the goddess of war, she was also the goddess of sovereignty. To the people of ancient Ireland, sovereignty was more than political rule. It was not merely the ability of a man to call himself king or to sit on a throne. Sovereignty was sacred. It was the bond between ruler and land, the mystical marriage that ensured the prosperity of a people. The king's authority was meaningless if it was not sanctioned by the divine powers of the land itself. And the Morrigan, in her role as a sovereignty goddess, was that power made flesh. In this aspect, she was not the shrieking crow or the spectral crone. She could appear as a radiant young maiden, beautiful and otherworldly, who offered herself to the king. This was not just a union of flesh, but a union of fate. To lie with the Morrigan was to be granted the right to rule. To refuse her, or to mistreat her, was to invite ruin upon oneself and upon the land. This connection between sovereignty and the feminine was a deeply rooted theme in Celtic belief. The land itself was personified as a goddess, and the king was her consort. His rule was only just if he maintained her favor, which meant ruling with wisdom, justice, and respect for the natural order. If he failed, the land would wither, crops would fail, cattle would die, rivers would dry up. In other words, the very earth would reject him. The Morrigan was one of the most powerful embodiments of this sovereignty goddess role. And like the land she represented, she could be nurturing and generous, or harsh and unforgiving. One story that reveals this side of her is found in her encounter with the Dagda, one of the chief gods of the Tuatha De Danann. On the eve of the great battle of Mag Twyrd, when the Tuatha De Danann were preparing to fight the Fomorians, the Dagda met the Morrigan by a river. There, she offered him her body, and the two lay together in a union that was not merely physical, but symbolic. Through this union, the Morrigan granted her favor to the Tuatha De Danann, strengthening their cause and ensuring the fertility of the land. Afterward, she prophesied their victory, her voice sealing the destiny of the battle. This scene tells us much about her sovereignty role. The Morrigan was the land, and by uniting with her, the Dagda confirmed that the gods had the right to rule Ireland. Her blessing was not just a boon, it was a contract between ruler and earth, sealed with blood, desire, and prophecy. But the Morrigan's sovereignty was never passive. Just as she was terrifying in war, she could be merciless in her judgment of rulers. If a king proved unworthy, she would curse him. This curse was not symbolic, it was real. Crops could fail, armies could crumble, rivers could flood or dry. The prosperity of Ireland itself was bound to her will. In this way, She was not only the goddess of sovereignty, but its enforcer. It is here we begin to see the full complexity of her nature. For sovereignty and war were not separate realms to the Irish. They were two sides of the same coin. To defend the land was to uphold sovereignty. To lose a battle was not only military failure. It was a sign that the king had lost the favor of the goddess. The Morrigan embodied this truth perfectly. She was the crow of battle and the maiden of sovereignty, the bringer of death and the giver of life. Another story that echoes this theme comes once more from the epic of Cuchulainn. At one point, the Morrigan appears before him as a beautiful young woman, offering him love and aid. When he rejects her, she shifts into other forms: an eel, a wolf, a cow, each attacking him, each representing forces of nature that he cannot truly defeat. Her rejection by him symbolizes his own doomed fate. He has spurned the sovereignty goddess, and in doing so, has sealed his death. His heroic deeds cannot protect him from the greater truth that sovereignty, fate, and death are intertwined, and all are in the hands of the Morrigan. What makes her sovereignty role so haunting is the way it reveals her as not just a goddess of destruction, but also of creation. She could grant kings their authority, make the land fertile, and bless her people with abundance. But she could also strip all of that away in an instant. She was the power that built kingdoms and the power that tore them down. In this, she resembles figures from other mythologies, goddesses who represent the land and the legitimacy of kingship, such as the Hindu Shakti, or the figure of Lady Sovereignty in Arthurian legend, where a knight or king must kiss a hideous hag who then transforms into a beautiful maiden, symbolizing his right to rule. But the Morrigan stands apart because of her duality. She is not only sovereignty, but also war, death, and prophecy. To unite with her is to embrace all of these at once. For the Irish, then, the Morrigan was a living reminder that sovereignty was not permanent, not guaranteed, and not gentle. It was wild, like the earth itself, capable of great bounty and great destruction. A wise king sought her favor not only through rituals or alliances, but through justice, courage, and respect for the land. To ignore her was to invite catastrophe. Thus, when we see the Morrigan not just as a war goddess, but as the goddess of sovereignty, her power becomes even clearer. She was the one who decided who would rule, who would fall, and whether the land would prosper or starve. She was not only the crow that circled the battlefield, but the soil beneath it, drinking the blood of the dead and feeding the crops of the living. She was Ireland itself, untamed, fertile, destructive, and eternal. To the kings of old, the Morrigan was more than myth. She was the embodiment of their greatest responsibility, to rule not for themselves, but for the land, and through the land, for their people. She could be a lover, a curse, a blessing, or a doom, but she could never be ignored. Among the many powers of the Morrigan, none is as unnerving or as revealing as her gift of shape-shifting. Unlike other gods who may take on disguises for convenience or trickery, the Morrigan's transformations are at the very core of who she is. She does not simply wear different forms, she is those forms: maiden and crone, wolf and cow, eel and crow. To understand the Morrigan, one must understand that she was never meant to be bound to a single face, a single body, or even a single identity. In Irish myth, shape-shifting was a symbol of power. To transform was to bend the natural order, to cross boundaries between human and animal, living and dead, spirit and flesh. And no figure embodied this power more than the Morrigan. Her shifting nature reflected the truths she governed: the chaos of war, the cycles of sovereignty, and the inevitability of death. Just as fate itself is unpredictable, so too was her form. Perhaps her most famous transformation is into the crow or raven, the bird most closely tied to her essence. The sight of a crow perched on the battlefield was not taken lightly by ancient warriors. They knew it was not merely a scavenger, it was the Morrigan herself, watching, feasting, and claiming the dead. Crows are liminal creatures, thriving at the edge of life and death, feeding on corpses, and moving between the seen and unseen. In the Morrigan's black wings and sharp beak, people saw the goddess's eternal role. She was the watcher of death, the herald of endings. But the crow was only one of her many faces. In the Tain Bois Quailnge, She demonstrates her terrifying versatility when she confronts the hero Cuchulainn. After he rejects her offer of love and alliance, she becomes his enemy. She shifts into an eel, wrapping around his legs as he fights, trying to trip him in the heat of battle. He wounds her, but she does not stop. Next, she takes the form of a wolf, lunging at his cattle and driving chaos into his life. Again, he wounds her. Finally, she becomes a cow, charging him directly. And once more, he wounds her. These transformations are not random. Each form carries deep symbolism. The eel represents slipperiness and entanglement, the way fate can coil around you and drag you down when you least expect it. The wolf symbolizes untamed destruction, the predator that stalks in the night, devouring livestock and striking fear into villages. The cow, by contrast, represents fertility, sustenance, and wealth in Irish culture. For her to appear as a cow and attack Cuchulainn is a chilling inversion. The very source of prosperity becomes a force of destruction. Later, she appears again to him, but this time as a frail old woman, milking a cow. She offers him a drink, and when he blesses her for her kindness, she is healed of the wounds he inflicted upon her in her other forms. In this moment, the Morrigan shows another truth of her shape-shifting. Through her forms, she reveals the interconnection of all things: youth and age, strength and weakness, destruction and healing. She is not one or the other. She is all of them. This shifting identity made her difficult to understand, and perhaps even more difficult to worship. Unlike gods who could be called upon in a single form, Zeus with his thunderbolt or Odin with his one eye, the Morrigan could not be reduced to a single image. To approach her was to accept uncertainty, to embrace mystery. She was the goddess of liminality, always at the threshold, always between states. Her shape-shifting also connected her to the cycles of life and death in the natural world. In her form as the crow, she represented the end of life, feasting on corpses. In her form as the cow, she represented abundance and renewal, providing milk to sustain the living. In her form as the maiden, she offered beauty and fertility. As the crone, she embodied wisdom and decay. To the Celts, who saw life as a continuous wheel, these shifting forms mirrored the eternal cycles that governed all existence. It is also worth noting how the Morrigan's transformations echo her role as a triple goddess. Just as she could be bad, machu, and Nemain all at once, she could also shift into animals and people at will. Her very identity refused to be singular. She was the goddess of and rather than or. She was maiden and crone, destroyer and creator, crow and cow. Her shape-shifting was not a trick, but a revelation. The divine is not bound by human categories. Other mythologies contain shapeshifters, Loki in Norse myth, or Proteus in Greek myth. But the Morrigan's transformations carry a more unsettling weight. Loki shifts to deceive, Proteus shifts to escape. But the Morrigan shifts to reveal. Each form she takes strips away another illusion, showing the many faces of war, fate, and sovereignty. She teaches that nothing is fixed, that power lies in transformation, and that to resist change is to invite ruin. Her shape-shifting also heightened her role as a goddess of fear. For what is more terrifying than an enemy who cannot be struck down? A woman who becomes a crow, a wolf, a cow, an eel, who slips through your grasp and returns again and again, each time with a new face, a new attack, a new omen. The Morrigan could not be contained, and that made her one of the most dangerous beings in Irish myth. But her shape-shifting is not only about destruction. It is also about survival. The Morrigan endures precisely because she can change. She is the crow who survives by feeding on death. She is the wolf who prowls the forests. She is the cow that nourishes. She is the old woman who persists long after youth has faded. Her transformations are a lesson in resilience, the kind that comes not from resisting change, but from embracing it fully. To see the Morrigan as the shapeshifter is to see her for what she truly is, the embodiment of the ever-changing, ever-turning world. She is the storm that takes many forms, but always arrives. She is the fate that approaches in 100 disguises, but never fails to arrive at your door. She is the goddess of the in-between, whose true form is all forms, and whose true face is all faces. And so, When we imagine her shifting on the battlefield, from a crow on a corpse, to a wolf tearing through the grass, to an old woman watching silently from the riverbank, we understand that this is not chaos. This is truth. This is the Morrigan, whose power is change itself. If the Morrigan were only a goddess of battle, she would already command fear. If she were only a goddess of sovereignty, she would already demand reverence. But it is her role as a prophetess that makes her truly terrifying, for the Morrigan does not merely watch the threads of fate, she speaks them aloud. And when she does, there is no escape. The Celts lived in a world where words carried weight. A spoken blessing could ensure victory, and a spoken curse could doom a man. To speak was to bind reality, and the Morrigan was a master of words. Her voice was a weapon sharper than any spear, for once her prophecy left her lips, it was already unfolding in the world. The most famous tale of her prophetic power comes from her encounters with the hero Cuchulainn, the greatest warrior of the Ulster cycle. Their relationship is one of the most fascinating and tragic in all of Irish mythology. On the eve of battle, the Morrigan appeared to Cuchulainn not as the fearsome raven, but as a young woman of unearthly beauty, radiant and alluring. She offered him her love, her favor, and her supernatural aid in the battles to come. With her as his ally, no enemy could defeat him, for the Morrigan was not only power but destiny itself. But Cuchulainn, proud and stubborn, rejected her. He scorned her advances, dismissing her aid as unnecessary. He was, after all, the Hound of Ulster, invincible in his youth, unstoppable on the battlefield. He believed his strength alone was enough. The Morrigan did not take rejection lightly. If her offer of love was denied, then she would give instead the gift of doom. From that moment on, she became his adversary, shaping his fate not with a lover's embrace but with a goddess's vengeance. Later, in the thick of battle, she came against him in a series of shifting forms. First as an eel, she tried to trip him in the river. Then as a wolf, she drove cattle to stampede over him. Finally, as a heifer, she charged him with the full weight of her fury. Each time, though wounded, Cuchulainn struck back, injuring her in every shape she took. But his resistance was futile. Each strike only bound him deeper to the doom she had foreseen. After the battle, when Cuchulainn was weary and bleeding, the Morrigan approached him again, not as a foe, but as an old woman milking a cow. She offered him milk to drink, and in return, he blessed her, unknowingly healing the wounds he had inflicted on her many forms. It was a strange, bitter reconciliation, but one that spoke of the inescapable intertwining of their destinies. Her final prophecy to him came years later, at the very end of his life. On the day of his death, as he rode to meet his enemies, he encountered a woman washing blood-stained armor in a river. She was the washer at the ford, a spectral figure of doom. This was none other than the Morrigan. To see her washing a man's bloody armor was to know that man was about to die, and the armor she washed was his own. Cuchulainn fought bravely that day, as he always did, but he fell at last, pierced with spears, tied to a standing stone so that he would die on his feet. And when the battle was over, a raven, the Morrigan's most feared form, landed on his shoulder. The prophecy was complete, but the Morrigan's gift of foresight was not limited to the fate of heroes. In the tales of the Táin Bua Cailnge, the great cattle raid of Cooley, she is said to have spoken words that foretold the outcome of the war itself. Her prophecies were not vague riddles, but vivid, detailed visions of bloodshed, destruction, and death. She did not offer hope, only truth, and the truth was often bitter. One of her most chilling roles comes after the battles are over. She is said to stand upon the battlefield, blood still fresh upon the ground, and sing of the doom to come. Her voice is not a comfort to the living but a dirge, a declaration that what has been lost will not be restored. She speaks of the end of worlds, of the fall of kingdoms, of the fading of glory into dust. Her prophecies remind us that all victories are temporary, and all men, no matter how mighty, must one day bow to death. The power of prophecy is, perhaps, the most unsettling of all her gifts. A warrior may fight against an enemy he can see, but who can fight against fate itself? To hear the Morrigan's voice was to know that your life was no longer your own. You could swing your sword, you could charge your enemy, you could shout your battle cry, but in the end, You were only acting out a story that had already been written. And that is the essence of the Morrigan as a prophetess. She does not simply reveal the future, she embodies it. She is fate walking among mortals, fate with a woman's face and a raven's wings, fate that seduces and destroys in equal measure. To meet her is to stand at the edge of the inevitable, staring into the abyss of what cannot be changed. Even the gods of Ireland did not escape her prophecies. She is said to have foretold not only the deaths of men, but the fate of the Tuatha Dé Danann themselves, that glorious race of divine beings who would one day be driven into the hollow hills, replaced by mortals who would inherit the land. In her voice, there is always an echo of endings, the fall of heroes, the fading of gods, the slow unraveling of all things. It is no wonder, then, that the Morrigan was feared above all others. For on the battlefield, there is always a chance of survival. In matters of kingship, there is always a chance to prove one's worth. But when prophecy is spoken, when the Morrigan whispers your doom, there is no chance at all. There is only the waiting and the slow march toward destiny. The stories of the Morrigan may be ancient, born in the smoky halls of Celtic storytellers and carried on the lips of druids and bards, but her shadow has never truly left Ireland or the wider world. She lingers, not just as a myth from the past, but as a presence that continues to inspire fear, fascination, and reverence. Her legacy is one of transformation, a journey from the blood-soaked battlefields of the Iron Age to the imaginations of poets, artists, and modern seekers of the divine. In the early days, the Morrigan was remembered as part of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the great race of deities who once ruled Ireland. When the Milesians, the ancestors of the Irish people, arrived and claimed the land, the gods retreated into the Sidhe, the hollow hills. But the Morrigan was not so easily hidden. Unlike some of her kin, who became distant figures, she remained close to the surface of human memory. People heard her voice in the caw of crows, saw her shadow in the flight of ravens, and felt her presence in the restless winds before war. She became a figure who lived half in myth and half in the natural world. Her role as a goddess of war and fate evolved into folklore that lingered in Ireland for centuries. She merged with the image of the banshee, the wailing woman of death whose cries foretold the passing of a soul. While the banshee and the Morrigan are not identical, their roles overlap. Both are women who warn of death, who stand at the threshold of the living and the dead, who make the unseen fate of men suddenly visible. In many ways, the banshee is the echo of the Morrigan, her divine terror reshaped into a ghostly figure that haunted the imaginations of later generations. Her presence also remained rooted in the Irish landscape itself. Rivers, hills, and valleys still bear traces of her name, as if the land remembered her even when people forgot. She was never just a goddess of the past. She was the embodiment of Ireland's sovereignty, and in this way, her spirit was believed to flow through the very soil. To walk through the misty fields of Ireland was, in some sense, to walk through her domain. But the Morrigan's legacy did not remain confined to Ireland. With the rise of literature, her name spread. Medieval scribes, writing down the sagas of old, preserved her role in the Táin Bó Cúailnge and other tales. Poets and storytellers drew upon her as a symbol of mystery, of power, of the unpredictable nature of destiny. By the Romantic era, when Celtic mythology was rediscovered with fresh eyes, the Morrigan was reborn as one of the most haunting figures of the Irish pantheon, an emblem of dark beauty and ancient terror. In the modern age, she has found new life in unexpected places. For some, she has become a figure of neo-pagan worship, honored as a goddess of strength, protection, and transformation. Modern devotees see in her not just the shadow of death, but the challenge of self-growth, the demand to face fear and rise stronger. Where once she terrified warriors with visions of doom, she now inspires seekers to embrace change, to acknowledge endings as part of life's natural cycle. She has also found her way into popular culture. In novels, games, and films, the Morrigan appears as a sorceress, a shapeshifter, or a dark queen. While these depictions often take liberties, they reveal something important. The Morrigan's essence still resonates. People today are drawn to her the way warriors once were, both fearful of and fascinated by her mystery. She embodies something timeless. The truth that power is never without cost, that beauty and terror are often two sides of the same coin, and that fate is inescapable. But perhaps her greatest legacy lies in what she teaches us about the human relationship with fate. In her prophecies, we see the reminder that no hero, no king, no god can escape the end. In her shapeshifting, we learn that life itself is change, that nothing remains fixed, that all things are fluid. In her sovereignty, we glimpse the bond between land and people, ruler and ruled, showing us that power is not owned but earned through service. And in her presence on the battlefield, we feel the truth that war is never glorious without cost, that death hovers even in victory. The Morrigan endures because she is not a simple figure. She is not just a goddess of war, not just a banshee of doom, not just a lover or a destroyer. She is all of these things at once, contradictory, complex, and deeply human in her divine terror. In her we see both the cruelty of life and its strange beauty, both the certainty of death and the promise of rebirth. And so, when a crow perches on a windowsill, or when a woman's cry is heard in the night, or when the wind before a storm carries an uneasy chill, some say the Morrigan is still near. She has never truly faded. She waits in the shadows, whispering of battles yet to be fought, of kings yet to rise and fall, of lives yet to meet their destined end. For the Morrigan is not only a goddess of Ireland, she is a goddess of endings. And as long as endings remain, her voice will be heard.